Today it is my pleasure to introduce to you Jocelyn Ashford. She works for Bridge Bio, and I've known her almost 4 years. She has been very instrumental in helping me understand what the industry is all about, and I am so thankful for her. And also, just to let you know, she's a budding artist. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Jocelyn.
Thank you so much, Deb. As Deb said, I have been around the hypopara community for almost 4 years now, and it's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you. And actually, it's been even more of a pleasure to have had the opportunity to meet many of you. So I wish I could see your faces, maybe next year. Well, today, my colleague, who you'll meet in a moment, Arun, and I are going to talk to you a little bit about our autosomal dominant hypocalcemia type 1, or ADH1 program. Just for a little bit more context, at Bridge Bio, I lead our patient advocacy efforts for this program, and that's why I'm here. Next slide, please. So this is a drug company presentation, so I must make sure to remind you that we're going to be talking about a molecule that we call encaleret. Encaleret is still investigational. It has not been approved, and it's still in clinical trials. And so while we'll share a little bit about encaleret, that is not intended in any way to be any promise of it getting approved in the future. Because it's not approved today and it has to go to regulatory authorities. Next slide. So you probably have heard throughout this presentation, well, you will hear throughout this presentation, and you've heard even in our introduction, a couple of names. One is Bridge Bio, and the other name of the company that we sometimes use is Calcilytix with an X. Throughout this presentation, we are going to call ourselves Bridge Bio, which is the big overarching company that actually owns Calcilytix, which is the smaller company. So Bridge Bio, we believe in hope through rigorous science. And what that means is that our whole purpose is that we work on conditions that in many cases, other drug companies have decided may not be the best option for them to pursue. Those are the types of conditions we work on. Often they are conditions that are genetic in nature, whether it be those that are passed down through families or cancers with genetic drivers. Next slide, please. A little bit more about Bridge Bio. ADH1 is not all we do. We see on the right-hand side of this slide, just a list of some of the other conditions that we work in. The one highlighted in purple is this program. So you can see here that we have completed our phase 2 program and are entering into our phase 3. And with that, I'm actually going to just have it jump right into Arun, who is my colleague. Hello, Arun. Arun and I have had the opportunity to work together for a couple of years now as part of Bridge Bio and on this program. And I'll let him introduce a bit more of himself. But if you do have access to last year's presentation, I encourage you to take a look. Arun's got a lot of energy, and I'm very fortunate to have the opportunity to work with him. And I hope you enjoy his presentation. Arun, back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jocelyn. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the Hypopara Association for having me for a second year. It's always nice to be invited back to something. So I just want to wish everyone on the call a happy Sunday. Also, it's actually Happy National Mother-in-Law's Day to everyone. That's right. Today is National Mother-in-Law Day. So if you want to go back to being the favorite son or daughter-in-law, you may want to make a quick phone call after this presentation. You're welcome. So let's go ahead and get right into this presentation about ADH1. Let me go take a step back for just a moment. In individuals, there is a receptor called a calcium sensing receptor, and true to its name, it senses calcium. So you've heard of the calcium sensing receptor through different presentations over the past 2-3 days. And if you were unable to attend, I'll briefly go over it just for a moment, so as a quick refresher. The calcium sensing receptor helps the body regulate serum calcium levels and maintain what your body perceives to be normal calcium levels. So actually in ADH1, which Jocelyn referred to as a genetic form of hypoparathyroidism, there's something a little abnormal about the calcium sensing receptor. You could think of the calcium sensing receptor as having an issue, which I guess many kids these days have, and it's that they become overly sensitive. That's right, they become overly sensitive. You can't really say much these days. But going back to ADH1, this calcium sensing receptor is overly sensitive to calcium. And this oversensitivity to calcium makes the body perceive that even normal levels of calcium is too much. So what happens is the body decreases parathyroid hormone secretion, and because of that, it in turn decreases serum calcium levels. And one way that this occurs is through increased urine calcium excretion. So the body tries to reduce calcium because it thinks you have enough and you have decreased blood calcium, and the body tries to do this by helping you urinate the calcium levels that you have. So what are some symptoms of ADH1? What you might see, what your doctor might see is listed on the right-hand side of the slide. And one is hypocalcemic seizures, or this is seizures due to low calcium levels. Also, numbness and tingling of the extremities is seen commonly in ADH1 patients. Tetany, or involuntary muscle spasms, which many times it is very painful. There's also long-term complications such as nephrocalcinosis, or calcified kidney tissue. Nephrolithiasis, which is calcium deposits in the kidney, such as kidney stones. And these can lead to chronic kidney disease or renal impairment. So these genetic variants, they cause ADH1 and make that calcium sensing receptor more sensitive to blood calcium levels. And it can lead to serious complications, as you can tell from this slide. So the symptoms that I mentioned on the previous slide, they do feel very similar. Maybe some of you on this call today may not have ADH1, may have hypoparathyroidism for other reasons, but maybe can relate to some of those symptoms that you saw on the slide. So even though the symptoms might look very similar between ADH1 and other forms of hypoparathyroidism, the differentiation, or how your hypoparathyroidism originates from, may actually have some other implications in terms of health. So here in this little box on the left-hand side of the slide, we see that compared to post-surgical hypoparathyroidism, patients with non-surgical hypoparathyroidism were found to have certain increased risks. And this is from a Danish national cohort study, the same one that Dr. Rubin just mentioned in her presentation right before ours. When it comes to FDA-approved treatment, there is no FDA-approved treatment that is specifically indicated for ADH1. Many of you on this call will be very familiar with what we refer to as conventional therapy or standard of care, which is comprised of calcium or oral calcium supplements in combination with active vitamin D or calcitriol. So according to a recent systematic literature review on ADH1 patients, we looked to go see how effective this conventional therapy or standard of care was for patients. And here we kind of see the results. So of the clinical case reports that we found that calcium and activated vitamin D helped to normalize blood calcium levels in these ADH1 patients 22% of the time. So not very effective. When we look at normal urine calcium levels, the standard of care was able to help in 29% of the patients. And obviously, as you all know from the previous slide, it's very important to normalize both blood calcium and urine calcium. And if you look at those patient case reports, only 2% of what was reported had both normal blood and urine calcium. So this is a bit of a balancing act. You want to normalize blood calcium levels to minimize the symptoms that you feel, but you want to reduce the risk of it spilling over into the urine because of all of those renal complications that I mentioned in the previous slide. And in patients for both blood and urine calcium, it's such a very low percentage of individuals who are able to normalize both. So this is a slide which I'll take a moment to pause so you can read, but it really goes over quotes from ADH1 patients, really describing that delicate balancing act that I just described in the previous slide. So here on the left hand of the slide, we can see quotes that relates to patients, how they describe their low blood calcium levels. So how they describe seizures, muscle cramps, pain, brain fog, fatigue, and other forms of, and how it impacts their mental health. And then on the right hand slide of the slide, you can see how they describe their symptoms related to high urine calcium, which is from kidney stones. You can see a quote that says, "I have kidney pain all the time." Also, this organ calcification. Because ADH1 is genetic in nature, that means that you're born with this variant in this gene. And you can kind of see in some cases that the manifestations or the clinical ramifications can begin early on in life. So you can see this quote that says, "Because of all of the calcium buildup, my kidneys calcified, and I was only 11 years old at the time." So encaleret is a molecule that currently we at Calcilytix or BridgeBio is working to develop to see if it may address the symptoms of ADH1 or what ADH1 causes in patients. And true to the BridgeBio model that Jocelyn described, it is designed to address ADH1 at its source, and which is the overly sensitive calcium sensing receptor. So this investigational drug is designed to reset what we refer to as the calciostat, which you've heard many times during this conference by Dr. Kahn, by Dr. Gaffney, by Dr. Roscoe. And this calciostat is, you can think of it as a calcium thermostat. And Dr. Kahn eloquently mentioned and described how even though your body wants to keep at this certain temperature, if it falls below, that furnace or like the heat should kick on to get you back to the right temperature. But in this, in patients ADH1, that does not occur. So encaleret is designed to address that calcium thermostat and help kind of fix that broken thermostat. So we think that if you can fix this thermostat, you can increase blood calcium levels and also decrease urine calcium levels. So this leads me to our current clinical development efforts, or our phase 2B study, which also Dr. Rachel Gaffney also went through a few days ago. Just real briefly, this study was split into 4 different parts, which the first 2 parts or periods was really intended to individualize the dose. We realized that patients with ADH1, you can't have a generalized dose for them. So we really spent some time to go see what dose works the best in each of these patients. So in period 1, there were 6 patients. Period 2, 7 additional patients joined them for a total of 13. And we presented these results throughout the past year and a half. So here in March of last year, October of last year, and most recently, we presented period 3 data in June of 2022. And now currently patients are in this last little phase or period, which is the long-term extension. So really from this study, what we wanted to learn was, is encaleret safe? How tolerable is it? How does encaleret affect blood calcium levels? How does it affect urine calcium levels? Is there any effect in parathyroid hormone secretion? So when we take a look at the baseline characteristics of patients or participants who are on the study, we can see a wide range of age. They were all adults spanning between the ages of 22 and 60. There were both male and females represented in this study. More than 3/4 of these patients had some sort of nephrocalcinosis or nephrolithiasis found at their renal ultrasound at baseline. Their calcium levels when looking at the normal range were low. Their intact parathyroid hormones were also low. And you can see here that 24-hour urine calcium was remarkably high when compared to the normal range. These patients were on supplements at baseline, and we found that there were 9 different unique variants of this gene, the CASR gene, that were represented in the 13 patients who participated in the phase 2b study. So one slide over the results. So what we found is that encaleret, it helped to restore that mineral homeostasis in these individuals with ADH1, and it helped restore that as we found that it normalized the following mean values, both in blood calcium levels, intact parathyroid hormone levels, the 24-hour urine calcium levels, blood phosphate, blood magnesium, and 125 dihydroxy vitamin D. From a safety standpoint, we found that encaleret was well tolerated over 24 weeks with no serious adverse events that were reported, which really gave us some confidence to say, look, this consistent improvements that we saw in these patients, it actually might suggest that encaleret may be an effective treatment for ADH1 patients. So this brings me to our first phase 3 study that we are supporting called Clarify, and it is a observational study both for patients with autosomal dominant hypocalcemia types 1 and type 2. And it is a observational study, so it is non-interventional. There is no study drug. It is a global study. It is really intended to understand how the disease presents and how it progresses over a certain time. We all know that you have experienced healthcare providers who may not really understand what you're going through. They may not really know much about the disease or how much about the symptoms or how well and how you need to be treated. So really the goal with the study is to really put together the largest group of patients that have been followed over a certain period of time in an effort to really learn and capture that information of what patients experience and go through. And part of that understanding is some of these things that is listed here below, which include kidney function, bone health, quality of life. And we really don't intend on this study being incredibly burdensome, and that is why we made these visits every 6 months, which may actually mirror how often you may see your specialist, if not even more frequent. So every 6 months, we really don't want this study to be burdensome, but it would be really helpful and informative to patients with this rare genetic condition. It would be helpful for you, for any family members that were affected, and for any future patients as well. So currently we are enrolling for this observational study called Clarify. We have sites in North America and Europe. We have a site in Canada that's open with Dr. Khan. We have sites in the United States, in Indiana with Dr. Eric Immel, in North Carolina with Dr. Mark Warren, in Ohio with Dr. Stephen Ng, in Texas with Dr. Bajaj. We also have sites in Europe, and we'll continue to open up even more additional sites as time progresses. And I encourage you, if you're interested, to go to clinicaltrials.gov. You could even type in ADH1 into the text box, and it'll take you to the study called Clarify. We'll continuously keep it updated with active sites, and we'll update it as new sites open up. We'll list information there below. If you're also interested and you happen to live in a different state and you're interested to know if we're planned to open up a site, I encourage you to either reach out to us or even reach out to the Hypopara Association. We'll definitely be able to help with getting you that information. So we move on to our next phase 3 study that many of you might be excited about, which is called Calibrate. And this is our phase 3 registrational study. Last year, I mentioned what the drug development process looks like, and I mentioned that phase 3 studies are that registrational study that is intended on getting FDA approval, and it's very highly rigorous, both from a scientific standpoint. So this is how the study looks like for our phase 3 study for patients with ADH1. So this study is intended for patients who are at least 16 years of age and older. It is a 2-arm study, so patients will be randomized in a 2-to-1 ratio. We are anticipating about 45 patients to be enrolled, and of the 45, 15 of these patients would go into the standard of care where they would receive calcium and calcitriol, and 30 patients, so in a 2-to-1 ratio, would be on the study drug. So they would remain on the study drug for about 6 months. Afterwards, all patients will be put onto encaleret afterwards. And really the intent of this study is to go see how many of these individuals or how many of these patients can achieve a normal blood calcium level and also their 24-hour urine calcium within the reference range. We'll also look at other secondary endpoints listed here, including urine magnesium and phosphate, how it affects bone turnover markers, and also, interestingly, the quality of life for patients. So we did develop also a questionnaire in concert with the Hypopara Association, which helped develop this questionnaire with us, really to intend to bring the questions and bring the quality of life assessments that are most interesting and most valuable for patients with hypoparathyroidism. So the Hypopara Association, not only did they help author some of these global clinical guidelines for patients with hypopara, they also helped develop this patient questionnaire for us for this registrational phase 3 study. When we look at the inclusion and exclusion criteria for Calibrate, as I had mentioned before, this study is for individuals with that are at least 16 years of age and older. You must have a variant in the CASR gene and must be experiencing or must have a history of signs or symptoms of ADH1. Exclusion criteria includes PTH treatment within 2 months of the screening period. So patients would have to discontinue the PTH treatment. Another exclusion criteria of note would be a history of thyroid or parathyroid surgery. Moving on to my next slide. So here is a good timeline of what our clinical development efforts look like stemming from last year and how it looks like moving forward. So in 2021 is when we really started that phase 2 proof of concept study. Here we are in 2022. We have Clarify is open for enrollment, and we anticipate having Calibrate, that phase 3 registrational study, open up before the end of this year, so very soon. And looking forward, even into 2024 and beyond, the plan is to go see how pediatric ADH1 patients might respond to encaleret, and maybe even other non-genetic forms of hypoparathyroidism might react to encaleret. So really, this is almost my last slide, and I really want to hit home the point that genetic testing could help with diagnosing different genetic forms of hypoparathyroidism. On the left hand of this slide, we can see what known genetic hypoparathyroidism variants consist of. There are about 26 different genes here listed here, and ADH1 really relates to certain variants in the CASR gene. However, there are other genes that can be affected, which can lead to hypoparathyroidism. And really the only way to know which gene is causing your hypoparathyroidism, if you have a genetic form, is through genetic testing. So if you want more information about genetic testing, I encourage you to go and use some of these resources listed on the right-hand side. One is the National Library of Medicine, the Genetic Testing Registry. It does provide you with names of labs that offer genetic testing for any of the genes listed on the left-hand side. Also, I encourage you to connect with the Hypopara Association, so your patient advocacy group, because they will have the most up-to-date information about genetic testing. As always, I really encourage everyone to stay connected with patient advocacy organizations and be well informed. If you want more information, I encourage you to go visit clinicaltrials.gov to find ADH1 trial information. You can find information about Clarify, about Calibrate shortly. I encourage you to speak with your healthcare providers as they can make the most well-informed decision about your health and about potentially participating in a clinical study. As I mentioned before, can't mention it enough again, stay connected with your local patient advocacy organization. If you have any additional questions for me, I encourage you to email medinfo@bridgebio.com. If you want more information, please reach out, as I will do my best to get you some answers. With that, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to spend some time here speaking with all of you, and we'll open this up for some questions.
Awesome. Thanks. All right, Arun, we've got some questions and we have some time to take some. So the first question I'd love for you to answer, I know that the language, we haven't talked a lot in the parathyroid hypoparathyroid community around the different types of hypopara as prominently. So sometimes the language can be confusing. When we say genetic hypoparathyroidism, do we also mean non-surgical? Are those the same thing?
Yes. So when we say non-surgical hypoparathyroidism, we're really referring to any patients who have low PTH or hypoparathyroidism, which wasn't a result of a neck surgery, of any sort of surgery on the thyroid gland or on the parathyroid glands. So genetic hypoparathyroidism is a part or a component of non-surgical hypoparathyroidism.
Great. So when you think about who might be eligible currently for a study for encaleret, how might you describe that in the context of using non-surgical hypoparathyroidism?
Yes. So if you are a patient with non-surgical hypoparathyroidism, it could be for many causes. As that one slide, which kind of talks over those 26 different genes, those are the genes that we know of. There could be other genes that have yet to be discovered, which causes low PTH levels. So in relation to our studies, that would relate to individuals with variants in a specific gene called the CASR gene. And this gene, if you have this variant in this gene, it helps code for the calcium sensing receptor. And this variant is what causes this calcium sensing receptor to be overly sensitive.
Great. Thank you, Arun. I have a couple of questions for you about the phase 2 clinical study and what we know about encaleret. So when you think about the patients who participated in the phase 2 study, how many of those still needed to take calcium and vitamin D while on encaleret?
Yes, that is a good question. So prior to starting the study, so before, as I mentioned in that baseline characteristics slide, you could see that patients were on conventional therapy. They were on oral calcium supplements and receiving calcitriol. So those two medication in combination with each other is important because you can take oral calcium both from a supplementation standpoint as well as from your diet, but it's very important for that calcitriol to be also there because calcitriol is what helps your body absorb the calcium that you intake from your diet and from supplementation. So without that calcitriol, without that activated vitamin D, you end up excreting calcium. So patients were on both and they discontinued those medications before they joined our phase 2 study.
Great. So by the end of the study, were all patients not on calcium and active vitamin D?
That's right. That's right. So patients were not on conventional therapy at the end of the study.
Excellent. What were some of the common side effects of encaleret?
Yes, as I had mentioned, it was well tolerated. There were no strong safety signals. There were some instances of phosphate imbalances or maybe a little high calcium levels, but that occurred during this period of time where we were escalating and really titrating the dose of encaleret for each specific patient. And once we got the dose correct, those symptoms resolved on their own. So it was encouraging to see.
Great, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of encaleret on kidney function, EGFR, creatinine levels?
Yes, so that is something that we continue to monitor. We want to go ahead and see, and it's one of the main components of our phase 3 studies is to assess renal or kidney health. We want to go see how renal health progresses, if it improves, if it remains the same, if it worsens over time on encaleret. And that is something that we are looking at. So more to come.
Great, thank you. So a little too soon for that long-term information, I guess. So 2 more questions, but these are around the phase 3 clinical study. The first is, so how, if one is on PTH therapy today, how might they get in, how long will it take for them to become involved in this study?
Yes, so if you're on PTH today, if you were talking about the registrational phase 3 study, which you would be able to receive potentially, encaleret either at the very get-go or at the very end of the study, then you would have to come off of the PTH at least 2 months prior to the screening period. So at least 2 months before beginning.
Great. And the last question is, how long before one might be able to enroll in the phase 3 clinical study? When do we think people might be able to raise their hand to participate?
Yes, so our phase 3 registrational study will be opening up very soon. We anticipate doing that before the end of the year. We're almost to the end of October, so that only leaves November and December. So very soon, and we'll make sure we alert the Hypopara Association as soon as sites are activated and live, and I'm sure they'll do a great job of conveying that information over to you, the patient.
Beautiful. And with that, we're all done with questions, and it's back to you, Patty.
All right. Thank you so much, Arun and Jocelyn. You guys are amazing. Thank you for, partnering with us and everything. We really do appreciate you.
Absolutely. And before I, give up the microphone, I'd like to give a quick shout out last year to the Calcilytix team. We'd like to do it quickly one more time. Some of these names might, sound different, but I assure you the mission remains the same. So Ananth, Ed, Lindsay, Mary Scott, Jocelyn, Jonathan, Scott, Roberta, Gustavo, Sabina, and Lena. Let's go.
Woohoo! Great job.